Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we are continuing our series of using this book here as a guide to self-improvement. Here to help me do that, as always, is the philosopher, the historian, the retired prosecutor, very handsome guy, all-around swell individual, one of my closest, dearest friends, and I'm absolutely honored to say that, Mr. James Valliant. Welcome back, sir.
Wow, always great to be here, and with with a factual introduction like that, so
Yeah.
objectively
Well,
described.
honesty is one of the virtues
Exactly. Yeah.
we're going to be discussing here. So, today we're focusing here on integrity. We've now arrived at the virtues. Last week we did independence. This week it's integrity. And integrity is loyalty in actions to one's convictions and values. So that is the standard. I mean, that's straight out of Webster's loyalty to principles. But to be a virtue, it can't just be loyalty to any principles. We could say a person does have integrity. For instance, as a Christian, they have loyalty to Christian values or Muslim values, but we're talking about loyalty to rational principles.
Has to be. And everything that we've said in the previous episodes here is really going to come into play, and we're going to
Right.
cash in here. My means of knowing anything beyond just seeing something in front of me are my words, are my principles, my concepts. We're talking about getting our concepts in order, our principles in order. Why? So we can orient ourselves to reality. It's my only means of knowing a reality or dealing with reality. And the only way for me to bring to bear all of my knowledge is to be integrated conceptually. That is to say, have my principles so logically well integrated, so firmly connected to reality that I can be confident in acting on them. If I don't act on principles, something we've said earlier, then what I'm doing is literally ignoring everything I know. If my concepts and principles are integrated, then what I'm doing with every decision is bringing to bear the entire sum of my knowledge on each and every decision that I make. But if the great enemy here, of course, is, you mentioned religion, and it's really important here. Being principled, being conceptual is not an option for human beings. That is to say, that is the form in which our knowledge, we contain it, we hold our knowledge and act upon it. Without concepts and principles, there is no such mechanism for acting on reality. But you see, religion has dominated the world of morality. It has had a near monopoly since the dawn of time on moral virtue. Why be virtuous? To get into heaven or to appease God, appease the gods. And if you have a set of principles that are detached from reality, then what your principles are doing is in effect, you're becoming the enemies of your life. They're becoming hostile to existence, to your existence, to your survival, to your thriving, to your prosperity. But I'll give religious people this much: integrity. To say that someone is acting on principle is already to pay them a half a compliment. They have principles. The first order of business with integrity, the intellectual component, we said every virtue has an intellectual and an existential component. The intellectual component of integrity is having principles, is developing understanding that I have to be fully consistent. My ideas have to be altogether integrated with one another and with the facts of reality. There are great moments in literature which are absolutely inspirational when it comes to integrity and living by principle. The ancient playwright Sophocles wrote a great play called Antigone. Or in more modern times, the modern playwright Robert Bolt wrote a great play, became a movie, Man for All Seasons. In both cases, they dramatize a religious person's integrity, their willingness to die for a principle, their willingness to put everything on the line for truth, for what they believe the
Yeah.
truth to be. Now, we can disagree with Antigone about the principle that she's willing to risk her life for, or or Thomas More in Man for All Seasons. We can
Or
disagree.
Andre in We the Living.
Andre and Ayn Rand has got Ayn Rand has the real answer to these guys. But when Thomas More in Man for All Seasons says, his friend says, well, why don't you just compromise this one time for friendship? And he says, well, when we go to hell, we're in front of St. Peter for judgment or whatever, and you go to heaven for adhering to your principles, and I get sent to hell for not adhering to mine. Will you join me in hell? And, no, the reason why I do it is because they're my principles, because they're mine. Thomas More emphasizes. He knows that he would lose his whole soul if he were, there's this Ayn Rand's favorite line from the Bible. For what shall it profit a man if he should gain the whole world but lose his own soul? Ayn Rand loved that because
Yeah.
you see, you lose everything. You lose the whole world, right? In the effort to gain the world but lose your soul, you must necessarily lose the whole world, is the great insight of Ayn Rand. So, yeah, there are things worth fighting for. There are things worth risking your life for, you know. And when it comes to adhering to principle, if they are aligned with reality, if they aren't religious values. See, the great thing about the Renaissance was Christian hypocrisy. Now, hypocrisy and compromise are the concepts that we really need to wrestle with here with integrity. It's living 100% 24/7 by your principles full time. That's the way principles have to work. If they're aligned with reality, why would you ever act? You'd be acting suicidally. You'd be acting in contradiction to the facts of reality. If they're reality based, but you see, the religion of the Middle Ages was not reality based. And so to become more livable, to become more human, to develop Renaissance art, these popes had to compromise and become hypocrites. And so the cardinals would come along and see all these naked people that Michelangelo was drawing on the papal chapel. Isn't that total hypocrisy? And Pope Julius is like, yeah, well, guess what? Reality, we can't live. See, and that's the ultimate problem with religious values. They cannot be lived in reality. They are suicidal in their impact. They will, at the end of the day, if you have integrity, they will set your values against your life. And so hypocrisy, in effect, becomes the best virtue of an unlivable ethics. On the other hand, hypocrisy is a giant red flag that your principles are screwed up. If you have the need to compromise, if you have the need to be a hypocrite, then there should be screaming alarms running off in the back of your head. My principles are messed up. My principles are not serving my long-term best interest. If, for example, you're trying to, and I have been in situations just like this, you meet a beautiful woman. She is just charming. She's a supermodel, let's say. And I'm not even exaggerating this context. She is just gorgeous. I mean, off the charts hot. And she's funny. And she's charming. And she's got all kinds of cool friends. So you're meeting all kinds of cool people. Maybe it's even helping you in other ways. And then you find out she doesn't have good character. That she is a liar. That she is a cheat. And you're not, and you go, wait, what seemed like what was going to be possibly a wonderful relationship and something, boy, it'd be great to get into the sack, the supermodel. And if you're trying to achieve these other values by means of a shortcut, by ignoring, for example, her being a liar and a cheat, then what are you setting yourself up for? Okay, if I do have a long-term relationship with this woman, what's going to happen down the road? How do I know she won't lie to me and cheat on me? If she's a liar and a cheat to this other guy or this friend of hers or in her work, then that should be sending off a red flag to me that as hot as this supermodel may be, it's not in my long-term self-interest to continue this relationship. I've got to cut it off. And it's really hard sometimes as every fiber in your body is saying, geez, she's so hot and I'm getting so many cool things. I'm going to great cool parties with her. Oh my, because she's a supermodel or something. Oh my God. And to be able to say, no, I'm sorry, this will not work out. We're just very different people takes a lot of courage. And that's the other component of integrity. If hypocrisy is a red flag that your principles aren't squared away, when your principles are squared away and they are reality oriented, it sometimes takes a lot of courage and long-term thinking. Let's say you work for your boss, and generally the business you're doing is honest, but you know that this guy is cheating, is cutting corners, is lying to certain clients. Maybe not all the time. Maybe not all the time. And you know, these religious ethics, they make it impossible to live full time. No one can be a full time altruist. No one can be a
Well,
full
that's
time
true.
self sacrificer. And so these compromises built into systems of ethics, that's why, let me put it this way, if ethics is the science of self interest, to put it in a way you might not like, if ethics is the science of selfishness, then
It's fine.
integrity,
I know what you mean.
yeah, not what most people mean by selfishness, and not what you'll get in most dictionary definitions. But if you mean by selfishness long-term self, your actual long-term self-interest, what really benefits you in the long run, okay, if your values are oriented like that, obviously it would be less tempting. But believe me, the long term can be very, very hard to hold in mind when there's a short term gain. I'll make you a partner in the firm if you go along with this boss who does cut corners. Wait a minute here. I could gain in the short run. I could gain this hugely lucrative job being a partner at some law firm or some accounting firm or something. Boy, the prestige and the money and the ka-ching that would be involved in getting that promotion. But you know that the boss is a compromiser. What danger, what minefield have you set out in front of yourself in the future? It could explode in your face at any time. This guy, you're now a partner with, in effect, a cheater, a liar, maybe even a criminal. If that's the case, then you have acted against your long-term self-interest for a short-term gain. And so the great enemies here are twofold. One, emotions, going by the emotion of the moment that
I'm
says
happy you said that. That's the enemy because emotions aren't the enemy.
emotions are not the
Yeah.
enemy. They are not. In fact, the way to be and have integrity is to get your emotions lined up with your actual values as much as possible. But you know, even there'll be moments when, oh, you know, you want to read a great, you know, Ayn Rand's fiction is filled with all kinds of great advice about integrity. And there's no better hero in literature that exemplifies this than Howard Rourke. Time and again, Howard Rourke is asked to compromise his aesthetic values. But then if he were to compromise his aesthetic values, he realizes that any value that he uniquely gives to the world of architecture, right, is just thereby destroyed. Not to mention his own values about the way our buildings should be built. So he's not doing himself any long-term favors. He's on self-destruct, literally destroying himself, his own values, and then at the end of the day, just becoming one of the herd. An architect like Peter Keating, who will just be indistinguishable from the mass of architects who give their clients whatever garbage they want. And so he realizes that to achieve what he wants, to have built the buildings he believes are the best, that he cannot compromise, not one little bit. And so he refuses to do that in order to become, and at the end of the day, who is the one who's going to be the most self-satisfied? Who is the one at the true to himself? You know, Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. You know, who's the one being true to himself? And by the way, who in the end will be the greater contributor to architecture? Peter Keating, who does the same old, or Howard Rourke, who revolutionizes the field. So if I'm going to be true to my own dreams, it'll also have the secondary consequence of benefiting the entire world. Okay, that wasn't my primary motive, it's true. But the practical is the moral here. The practical is the moral here. Only by being consistent and ruthlessly consistent, habituating, making an absolute out of those principles, just like reality is an absolute, can you really achieve your long term self interest?
Jim, I got a question for you,
Yeah.
right? You just mentioned the moral is the practical. That's the case in objectivism because objectivism, the ethics in objectivism is what might be called in a philosophy class teleological ethics, meaning it's means and ends. So in objectivism, the end is your own life, and the means are what leads to the benefit of your own life. Utilitarianism is also teleological, but the standard is an unmeasurable greatest number for greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, when you go back nowadays we have the sort of this religious view of ethics, but it wasn't always that way. Going back to Aristotle, his ethics was also a teleological ethics, which with the end was human flourishing or eudaimonia. And it seems like with religion and then Immanuel Kant, the teleological view of ethics is almost not even thought of by people when they discuss the topic. They just assume that ethics is a list of commandments or a list of duties imposed on us, that they're not a function of reaching goals.
Right.
Is it just religion and Kant that has led to that?
Well, there are many secular, atheist, agnostic type utilitarians, but look at what they've done. They've adopted an altruist, an unlivable standard that has its ultimate roots in religion. If I were to ask the utilitarian, why is the greatest happiness or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number good? Why should I worry about? And first of all, it's an impossible calculation. Just like any form of altruism, it can't really be lived up to. I mean, it's suicide, right? Either suicide right now or suicide on the installment plan. And so if I were to say, question why to the altruist part of the utilitarian, he would fall back on some kind of religious or emotional, the pragmatist who chucks in principles. That's the being unprincipled on principle sort of philosophy. By pragmatism, I mean capital P, pragmatism, not the word we use for being practical, because there's nothing more practical than being principled, even if it means a short-term loss in the benefit for the benefit of a long-term gain. You know, if I talk to a drug addict, they understand. You know, I've had friends who've had drinking problems, and what happens is they, say, that's it. I'm not going to drink, and so I'm never going to drink again. And I've got to be 100%, and I've got to be perfect. And what kicks in for me is that's right. Every time I'm out with you, I'm ordering a ginger ale or an iced tea. I'm going to help this person be principled, even if it's not a necessary principle for me. I admire the principled adherence to, that's it, I can't take this risk anymore. For me, the long term absolutely outweighs whatever short term gain I have in getting my fix, whatever that fix is, whether it's heroin or whether it's getting that supermodel in bed, or whether it's getting that wonderful partnership at the firm. If you compromise on your moral values, then what you've done is you've set a ticking time bomb under your chair of self-destruction. Oh, well, just this, give me this one drink. I could really use a glass of bourbon right now. The stresses in life have really gotten to me. And that's one of the things about integrity. We have to recognize that there are moments in life that are really going to test our integrity, that are going to test the long term. And emotions are one thing we have to monitor and constantly control, because sometimes our emotions, our lust for the supermodel or our desire for the money, or boy, just having that one glass of whiskey right now, would be really, in the short term, it might be emotionally satisfying or at least pain reducing. And so I'll compromise on that. Compromise, the enemy of integrity. If you know your principles, there's never, ever an excuse for compromise.
When you say compromise is the end of or the enemy of principles, my friend Brent used to always say about people like that they live their life according to clauses. That well, this time it's for this, or this time it's for that. Right now, you mentioned the long term, suffering short term loss for long term gain, and what allows us to understand and look into the future. I think we talked about this when we've been over concepts earlier in principles. The principles that we live by help us to understand the long term ramifications of actions. And Leonard makes a great point here, where he talks about few men flout their perceptual knowledge, aside from the lowest cases, such as those who are high on LSD or on the Reverend Jim Jones. A man does not walk into the path of a speeding truck because I feel like it or because the leader expects it. The consequences of such actions are too clear. On the conceptual level, however, The consequence of flouting one's knowledge are not thus inescapable. On the contrary, to keep one's value judgments operative amid the vicissitudes of life is a volitional task. And it can only be done if you are guided by principles. So, I had a debate once with Dr. David Friedman, and he has what he thinks is a very strong argument against the objectivist ethics. And he talks about the prudent predator, the guy that can get away with preying on others and succeeding and becoming prosperous. And I told him, you're not grasping the objectivist idea of principle. That such a person will not succeed long term, even if you could find the exception somewhere out there. It doesn't prove the principle false, because we have to live by principles. And I told him, by the way, I have an abundance of concrete examples from people that I've been in prison with, of people who thought they could live as the prudent predator you're talking about and simply could not. So it's not the
prudent predator in objectivism is a
contradiction in terms, right? So Leonard talks about in principle. He says that integrity is the principle of being principled. In another lecture that he gives on understanding objectivism, he talks about taking our concepts, our principles, and making them as clear to us as that oncoming
the perception
truck.
Exactly.
So we understand that to violate principle is to do, as he talks about in Evading Reality, to play with a lighted fuse.
Exactly.
And you never know when it's going to go off. People I could go out and commit a robbery tonight and get away with it.
Jim, why are you always honest? Even when it looks like, Jim, you didn't, why did you do that? Why did you tell that white lie, Jim? Why did you, hurt that person's feelings? Or why did you sacrifice what would have been a clear short-term gain by being so honest? No, if I were to tell a lie, it's like that ticking time bomb. I feel like someone is just putting my feet on a railroad track with a locomotive coming at me at 100 miles an hour. And that is really, when you've integrated your principles to the point where you can feel it like it's perceptual, like it is that truck that people wouldn't walk out in front of, then you understand both the reality basis of your principles, right? See, that's the thing. That's how religion screws us up. It's not, you don't reduce your principles to reality. Your principles are going to be now set against your life. That's why it's absolutely vital. But when you do have it, then it works the other way around. So the famous story of Ayn Rand being offered, $1 million by a Texas oil man, if she just compromised and put a little religious element into her ideas, she literally said to her student, Leonard Peikoff, what good would that $1 million do me?
None.
Honestly, you make it $10 million. What good will it do me if I have to compromise my ideals in the long run? I'd be selling my soul and working against myself. Ayn Rand, her novel, The Fountainhead, we've just been talking about, was rejected by a dozen publishers. She refuses to compromise. Her play goes on to Broadway, and the famous producer on Broadway wants to change her lines, and she's fighting this pitched battle to keep her lines intact. Why? Because what good would fame and fortune do her? What if George Abbott produced this perfect, success that would have people walking around, lined up around the block to see it and make her famous? What good would the fame and fortune do her? The fame and fortune would actually be a kind of concretization of all of that compromise. You know what I mean? How could you possibly enjoy it on the internal level, because you're acting against what your true values are? But more than that, in action, it would actually work against your life and against your values. And as I say, at any moment, let's say you get away with it for a long time. Okay, I've gotten away with it this long. I've gotten away with it this long. The prudent predator. No. Wait a minute. If I'm a predator, I'm making enemies. And all that has to happen is one mistake, and boom.
Boom, blows up in your
face.
Boom.
The reason why I don't start shooting guns is, because, the bullets will start flying and one might hit me. Okay? If you see it with that clarity, if you see any attempt to force another person with the clarity of well, this implies a dangerous threat to me and my security. When you see it that clearly, you're never going to be tempted to force another human being. Similarly with lying. And so what you have to do is you have to be able to connect the abstract to the real in such a way that hypocrisy is this giant
Yes.
red flag, is this, no, I've got, my principles are screwed up. If hypocrisy is actually a good thing, like say it was for the Catholic Church in the Renaissance, then what it is it's an ideology in decay,
Yeah.
principles in decline, as it must be. No, there is never, once your principles are aligned with reality, there's never any excuse for compromise or hypocrisy.
So, Jim,
Never, ever, ever.
there's two great books, and I'm going to use the second one to make a point, but that illustrate integrity, but not integrity to the objectivist ethics. They're just people with integrity pursuing values. Both by Victor Hugo. One is 93, where everybody on this each side of the conflict, not everybody, but a lot of the characters demonstrate integrity and value pursuit. It's a great, great story. The second one is Les Miserables in the character of Jean Valjean. And I bring that up because there are situations, and this is not, I just want to be clear, part of objectivism. This is my own observation from my own life, where integrity, even to rational principles, can work against you. And this is, I want to tell a story to illustrate it from Les Miserables. In the story Les Miserables, of course, Jean Valjean first steals the bread. He does get an excessive sentence, but he escapes, repeatedly, which aggravates the sentence. And then even when he gets out, he robs the little kid, for the coin. And there comes a time where he is now successful. He's living as the mayor in a town. He's come up with a great invention, made him very rich, very prosperous. And a guy gets accused of stealing, or the guy stole something. He actually did steal. I think he stole fruit from somebody. And they think it's Jean Valjean that did it. And that means this guy's going to face way more of a harsh sentence that he would face for just a simple theft. And now Jean Valjean, in one of the greatest scenes I've ever read in any novel, it's called The Tempest in a Skull, where he's weighing doing the right thing. He's saying, can I let this guy suffer for what I've done? And he goes through a whole thing. He said, look, I've turned my life around. I'm a good person. This guy's a scumbag. He doesn't use that. That's my terminology. Even if he gets off, he's just going to go steal again. Why do I have to do the right thing? And he ultimately determines that he's going to do the right thing, knowing he's going to suffer for it. And this wasn't going to be short-term suffering. This was long-term suffering. And what I've identified, it's always keep in mind what I call it's the principle of Jean Valjean. Because when I was in prison, there were many, many times where doing the right thing was turned against me. But it was because of my previous decisions and the way that I had previously lived my life. Now, sometimes being honest went against me. For instance, when Brent McCall and I were writing the book Down the Rabbit Hole, and I was going for a sentence reduction, I had to tell the prosecutor what I was doing because I didn't want him to get blindsided. It was the right thing to do. It could have cost me my freedom. But what was I going to do? But that was a function of the previous bad choices I made, which only illustrates for me the importance of making good decisions now so that in the future, doing the right thing won't come back and bite me in the ass.
And especially if we've put ourselves in that situation.
Right.
Let's say you've done something wrong and foolish in your youth, and that someone is blackmailing you based on it. You've improved your life, you've turned it around, and they threaten you. The thing to do is to go straight up and make a public statement. I did something wrong. To tell your new employer, beat the guy who's blackmailing you to the punch. Take away their cause of blackmail. Admit you did wrong.
Right.
Take the hit now. Now, sometimes that can really, like in the Jean Valjean case, I know I'm probably ending my freedom for the rest of my life, but I can't do that because any value that I would have to the freedom or to the admiration or to the continued success would be thereby completely under. What's great about Victor Hugo, a friend of mine who's a novelist actually put it this way. He said his heroes hold their lives in the palms of their hands at every moment. and they're assessing the long-term consequences of their behavior. And with Jean Valjean, you can see it there. He knows that his soul, for what should it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his own soul? I'm going to lose my own soul, which makes all of that other stuff possible. And it's astonishing how many times, if you come clean, and I've seen this with so many different people, my advice to them is always come clean now. Tell the person. Don't let the person blackmail you. Don't let this be an ongoing, because guess what? You're going to be living in fear for the rest of your life. You want to live with that fear that could explode in your face for the rest of your life, or do you want to face it now? And 9 times out of 10, though, you'll get credit for coming clean. So we say, I learned it from you. I learned it from you. You had the integrity to be true to this, and that will gain you some credit. Now, think about it, though, when a person is, let's go all the way, a person risking their life for what they see as the conditions of human living and survival. So if some Nazi dictatorship wants to take me over, will I risk my life? Absolutely. If a Nazi takes over, then all the conditions that make my life worth living will be altered, changed, put in danger. Is that a moment worth risking my life for? Yes, it is. Now, we take calculated risks like that, and that is the essence of courage. The essence of courage is acting in the face of some short-term gain, like my immediate survival of the moment, perhaps, my safety of the moment, or keeping this job under some false pretenses, or letting that other guy take the blame, and like Jean Valjean, being able to put those short-term things aside and acting with the courage that your principles demand of you. Being principled is the essence of courage for Ayn Rand. Being adherence to principle means adherence to reality and the truth and your perception of the truth and reality, and never compromising on that. So if I don't act to risk my life in the face of being enslaved, then what the hell why am I doing anything else?
Right.
That's why it's so, when we talk about self-improvement, we talk about the intellectual component. People say, well, this being principled and engaging in this ethics business is really, I have to think and be Yeah, when we were saying rationality is important or independence is important, when we were saying it's important to be logical for self-improvement. Why we're saying that is self-improvement. If ethics is indeed is the science of being selfish, integrity is the technology. Integrity is when the rubber hits the road, adhering to reality as best you understand it. Anytime, as I say, hypocrisy seems like the better alternative, anytime compromise seems like the best alternative, you have screwed up principles. But if your principles are aligned with reality, then you have to be true to them no matter what, because it is your life and survival that we're talking about here. So if, and this is really another key aspect of integrity, standing up to your enemies is real easy. Standing up to your friends when they're wrong is a real sign of integrity. The courage to stand up against your own social community, against the people that, I party with these people, I'm friendly with these people, we chat and we have a great time. I could risk that entire social network. Is so wonderful to have. But a lot of people, they substitute their own principles for the principles of other people. Most people are not consistently rational and principled and have worked out this science of ethics. And so the technology of it, integrity, living by it, actually living by it, taking the calculated risk, because that's what it really is, of risking my life, say, to fight off slavery and dictatorship. Taking that calculated risk is what integrity requires under those circumstances. So it may seem in the short run like, boy, Jim, you're being just so stupid. But how many times, time and time and time again, if I was the guy as a DA that people, if they filed a case that had to be dismissed because some new exculpatory, some evidence that showed that we were wrong in filing the charge, this guy could in fact be innocent, there's at least a reasonable doubt that this guy didn't do the crime, okay, we go into court and dismiss. Now, because I was very demanding, this rarely happened to me, but there were times when I came into court and said, oh, I had no idea. That at least creates a reasonable, he may be probably guilty, but that at least creates a reasonable doubt. And therefore, I don't have a good faith basis to keep going. So I walk into court and I proudly stand up in front of the judge. And I say, Your Honor, the people of the state of California moved to dismiss this case. I could do it with such comfort and such pride that guess what? Half the prosecutors in the office said, well, Jim, could you go into court and dismiss it? And I'd look at their case and I'd say, why did you even file this case? But I said, oh, because, well, there was probable cause. I understand, but that's not what we have to prove. We have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And here's this big, fat, giant reasonable doubt that you knew all along could, because happened less to me because I had higher evidentiary standards. But if they let something slip by and they say, oh, yeah, I should have been more attentive to that. Well, now you know there's reasonable doubt. You got to go dismiss it. Jim, could you go to court and dismiss it for me? I'd be the guy, no matter what it made our office look like. No matter how it pissed off the cops, no matter how it pissed off a potential victim even. Okay, let me do the interview with the victim. Look, I was victimized, and the cop said there was probable cause that he did it. I said, well, that's not my standard. And I have to go by the law. I have to go by my integrity. And my integrity, if it requires it, means I stand up and I say, my office made a mistake. And I don't care if I piss off the community, the potential victim, and that's the way I'll put him now, or the cops, or anyone else. Or if someone says, hey, it just shows your office is filing frivolous charges, screw that. Much better to have the reputation as our office, as the office that does the right thing, that says case dismissed when we have a reasonable doubt that emerges in our investigation. That takes integrity. And if you don't have integrity, if you don't become comfortable in your ability to forego the short-term benefit for the long-term benefit, doing the right thing, doing justice, becoming then known as the prosecutor or the prosecution office that always does the right thing and isn't just out to get newspaper headlines, advance your political career, appease the mob. And sometimes that's what you're doing as a prosecutor. You're resisting appeasing a mob with pitchforks and torches that wants the head of some guy. And you say, I'm sorry, we just don't got the goods. This is a clear case of reasonable doubt. We can't go forward. Here's a real life example from me, for example, my life, where I had, and what was at the end of the day, after 18 years, and I was telling people that I was retiring, the judges and the defense bar and the good prosecutors all said to me, Jim, you are a man of integrity. You're a man who sticks by his principles and you will do the right thing no matter what. And that is solid gold that I would not trade, my brother, for anything in the world. That view of me was what I gained at the end of the day. I also did justice. The reason why I became a prosecutor was to do justice. And so why would I be cutting corners on justice if that were my original motive? So looking back on my career as a prosecutor, I can say I consistently did justice. And then all the other fringe benefits, I have now the reputation as a man of integrity. You see, that's priceless.
Yes.
You gain in the long run these priceless values of actually doing justice, of having the reputation of the guy who'll do the courageous thing, even when there's an angry mob out there, even when it may make your office look bad in the short run, even when you've pissed off the local police agency. To be able to stand up like I did in one case, and the cop lied, and the headline in the newspaper the next day read, DA accuses cop of lying. And the boss calls you into the office. Believe me, I've had that very experience where the boss calls you into the office and says, tell me the context. Why did you call one of our fine men in blue? Why did you call one of them a liar? And I explained the situation. And if you have a good boss, the boss will do what he did in my case. Keep doing the right thing, Jim. You're doing the right thing. And
Nice.
that's because sometimes you have to stand up against who your friends would be. See, I'm a prosecutor. Normally it's the cops. You have to stand up to your friends, and that can be the hardest thing to do in the world. Say, no, I'm not going to go along with that. I'm not going to go along with some corner cutting, some cheating, some lying, something that in fact would, in the long run, defeat the cause of justice, or in the long run, potentially hurt my reputation. Not a chance. I'm not going to do it. It's that ticking time bomb. But when your values and your principles are aligned with reality, then you have this enormous courage. Religion gets us to believe that compromise is necessary because we can't live the religious values. You can't live up to the turn the other cheek, live in poverty and celibacy kind of. It's not meant to be livable, or sacrifice yourself consistently for other people. You can't do that. You have to be selfish in the good sense. Every breath you take is selfish. Every morsel of food I eat. I couldn't be a full-time altruist, but that's the point. They build in a system where compromise and hypocrisy are the best features, are sort of necessary to get along. As I say, that should be the huge red flag. That's why ethics is so critical to your well-being. It is the science of your long-term well-being. Integrity is the necessary technology. If you find a problem in consistently applying those principles, then there's something wrong with those principles. They're not geared towards life on earth, and in particular your life on earth. What they're geared to is something else, some supernatural standard. The other great thing is social pressure. Oh my God. Social pressure is a huge, huge thing. Oh, you may be the most popular guy in the room. You may be beloved by everybody because you're getting along with everybody. Now, that's another red flag right there. If you're getting along with everybody, if there's never a moment where that's why when it's two virtuous people, respecting their difference is a matter of respecting their independence and their integrity, right? Now, will I go along if I really disagree with what they're doing? No. I will disagree with them. I'll state my disagreement. I might not even join them in their venture. But if for them that is independence and integrity, I'm at least going to recognize the independence and integrity that they are exhibiting, with the warning, I don't think you're right about this. Okay? I'm not saying it has to end a friendship, but if necessary, I will end a friendship. I must. I must. What good is that friendship doing me? What good could the long-term benefit of that relationship be for me if it requires that kind of a compromise? Ayn Rand's literature is filled with all kinds of, for Ayn Rand, she was disgusted. We talk about religion and principles. Ayn Rand was disgusted at the notion of platonic love. She thought it was sheer hypocrisy and cowardice. Because if these are your values, then they're the values that make your life worth living, right? If I say to a beautiful woman, I mean, it's all over the place. If I were to compromise, for that short-term gain as opposed to the long-term gain, I'm actually, as I say, working in the course of destroying myself in the long run. And so what we have is we have a world in which people love and admire the idealist, the dreamer, the impractical guy who self-sacrifices for the long term, or we have the practical guy. Leonard Peikoff says what his dad presented him as a teenager with two basic alternatives: you're either an idealist or you're practical, and you've got to make a choice. Leonard, is what his dad told him. His dad was a very successful surgeon in Canada. And he always thought that idealism and practicality were two different things. And so his very first question to Ayn Rand was on the question of just that. Is Howard Rourke an idealist, or is he meant to be practical? Because the two can't coexist in the same time and in the same place. You're either practical and you get things done, or you are an idealist and expect to suffer and be the starving artist and being the guy who lives alone and doesn't have any friends. Well, that is a false alternative, according to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand believes that ideals can be achieved, and that if our ideals are aligned to reality, then we just demand they be achieved here on earth. And I got just a couple of quotes from Ayn Rand that are just too irresistible for me. In We the Living, her very first novel, one of the great lines from the heroine is, "It's a great gift, you know, to feel reverence for your own life and to want the best, the greatest, the highest possible, here, now, for your very own. To imagine heaven and then not to dream of it, but to demand it." To demand heaven on earth. It's only possible if your head isn't in the clouds of a supernatural heaven. If heaven, by that we mean the ideal, the highest possible, and it is reality based, then we should demand every time of ourselves, by the way, and this is what integrity amounts to, demanding of ourselves the quest for the best. Demanding of ourselves. Follow up on that. A play Ayn Rand wrote called Ideal. One of the characters asks, of what do you dream? And the person responds, nothing. Of what account are dreams? The response, of what account is life? Response, none, but who made it so? Response, those who can only dream, who cannot dream. Response, no, those who can only dream. If your dreams are disconnected from reality, if what you think of as the highest is a literal supernatural heaven, then you are doomed to a world of compromise, hypocrisy, being a fraud to yourself and betraying all of your values, or getting along in the world and being successful. No, but if your dreams are aligned with reality, then there's never an excuse to compromise one little micron. If your dreams, if your ambitions, if your view of heaven is a very natural, this worldly view of heaven, then never compromise one little centimeter, even if you have to stand alone, even if it's just you standing alone against the entire world for that, it's absolutely worth it. Ayn Rand was much, much harder on free market thinkers than she was on other kinds of thinkers. Really, generally, she was. And so she'd reserve some of her harshest criticisms for people like F.A. Hayek or Milton Friedman. They are not principled advocates of freedom. They're willing to compromise. To them, it's not a principle that that the government doesn't engage in this ever, 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 ever. She had a moral principle about the free market. For her, it wasn't just a matter of, the practical mechanics of economics. And so some of her harshest criticism was on these economists who were willing to compromise on the issue of the free market. It's similar with Ludwig von Mises in the famous meeting at the Mount Pelerin Society. Oh, you're all a bunch of socialists. And here they are, the most free market oriented historians and economists in the world gathering. And he's saying, you're all, but because to him, it's a matter, you could tell, as he didn't have Ayn Rand's ethics by any means, but there was something I like about Mises that makes you just want to hug him, because what he's saying is this: if it's a principle, it cannot be compromised. We cannot give an inch. You give an inch and you've given the whole thing. Ayn Rand would say, if a burglar broke into your house and you started negotiating over the spoons, you said, oh, please you can take the spoons, but not the knives. You've compromised on the very principle and expect more blackmail, theft, whatever the case may be. You've now compromised on the principle and you've said it's okay. You've sanctioned that. No. You've got to draw the line and say, no theft. I mean, I'm not saying be suicidal if an armed robber has entered your home or something, but, give them the spoons, but then follow it up. Or if you can defend yourself, defend yourself. The point is, you don't compromise on a matter of spoons. If a dictatorship is truly a threat, you don't negotiate with it, Mr. Trump. If indeed Iran is all the evil things that Iran is, a threat to Western civilization, a killer of Americans, an evil regime, totalitarian theocracy, then what the hell are you doing having any compromise, negotiation with them at all? No deal between a free country, a relatively free country, and a dictatorship can ever benefit the free country. Ayn Rand was very, very strict about this idea. To recognize a dictatorship is already to act against your own interest as a free society, is already like sanctioning that burglar and saying, yeah, it's okay. I'll let you get away with, well, what is appeasement in World War II? We let Hitler have, well, let's let him have Czechoslovakia. Let's let him remilitarize the Rhineland. Next thing you know, he's invading Poland because and then France, because, well, guess what? You've compromised on the principle. You gave in to the principle. You've rewarded the principle. Now expect it to be forever lost because guess what? The world works in terms, if your abstractions actually reflect the principles that govern the world. And see, that's the thing. Conceptual knowledge penetrates beyond the perceptual. Like Leonard began in this thing, we are in touch with a higher truth. And by higher truth, I do not mean supernatural. I mean one that's not readily perceivable. But once you've abstracted that truth, that might not be visible, this invisible truth, say a respect for rights, instead of being this mystical thing, Jeremy Bentham's nonsense on stilts. If we understand that a respect for rights is a principle, an abstract principle, then we realize that any compromise on that, whatever, is actually working against my long-term self-interest. Against my long-term self-interest. I let them get away with rights violations here, 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 here. Well, don't be surprised when you open your bag and suddenly none of your rights are there.
A bag of rights. So, Jim, when we discussed concept formation and ideas, we talked about how there's two tests for ideas. The first and primary course is, do your concepts, do your ideas correspond to reality? Are they rooted in reality? So there's sort of the reduce them to sense perceptions. But another test is, do new ideas, new concepts contradict other concepts and ideas you already have? And then something's amiss, one has to go, and then of course go to reality. And it's similar with ethics in that you first want to test anything you're going to do against your own life. Does this actually benefit me or does it harm me? But what integrity does is you can also check it and measure it by the principles. That does this violate productiveness? Does this violate honesty? Does this violate justice? Is this in accordance with my values? And that serves as sort of an extra security measure to make sure your behavior is ethical. And to live a life of integrity, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, what's some good advice to instruct somebody how to do it? And I would say, first of all, identify your values and your principles in clear, verbally articulated form. Know what they are. And then anytime you're going to take an action where you're uncertain, it's new or you don't know, is this in line with the values and principles that I've adopted, and how will it affect my long-term best interest? And as long as you keep those things in mind, you're on your way to having a life of integrity.
That's it. Work out those. If you run across a contradiction in your mind, contradictions don't exist in reality. They don't. A is always A. Things cannot be their opposite at the same time and in the same respect.
But a-holes don't always have to be a-holes.
There, it's a matter of context. But the truth is, you're right. If your principles are reality-based, right, then, and if you're consistently like that, and there are times when you will have principles that say, well, wait a minute, how does this work in concert with my other principles? How does this idea work does this contradict one of my principles? If there's any moment you have a contradiction between and A and B, then that demands the virtue of rationality, being aware that we're conceptual beings. The principles are my only way of knowing reality, and adhering to my best understanding of reality is absolutely crucial. You have to sort of be a philosopher, ladies and gentlemen. Self-improvement requires, as you point out, using our words, saying out loud, or writing, journaling. I don't care how you do it, but you've got to use your words. Words are not just a means of social lubrication. Words are not just getting along with people, they're not just even communication. Words are a vital means of thinking and knowing by yourself and to yourself, and working out those principles, those words, and working them out consistently and knowing how your ideas are themselves fully integrated. Isn't it interesting how the word integrity has both of those aspects? Integrity in your own mind, because the functioning of your own mind has a certain integrity. When we get to honesty and certain other justice, for example, one little compromise with reality, we realize, explodes the whole thing. You cannot be honest and allow an occasional lie into your mind. You're destroying the integrity of your own consciousness. More than that, if you have a principle and you know it's reality based and you know it's consistent with everything else you know, ever acting against it is obviously a form of risking everything. Risking everything. There are people who are, most people don't do this at all. They are not really ethical beings in the full sense of having ethical principles all worked out. And therefore, they're kind of going by the emotion of the moment and what is socially convenient and makes you popular on the one hand, or what's emotionally convenient, the easiest on me and my stress level, because sometimes I got to take the stressful choice, as we've pointed out. No, no, no. It's not a matter of emotional convenience or social convenience. You've got to stand up against those. Those are the two great forces that integrity demands that we stand up against when necessary. It's not that that's what the essence of life is, but you have to be able to stand up against what might be, in the short run, emotionally satisfying or socially convenient. Socially convenient. Those are the two great enemies. Then those are the two great causes of hypocrisy and compromise. And integrity, believe me, when you develop, there's nothing more powerful than a reputation for integrity, an earned reputation
Yes.
for integrity, both with other people and more than that, when you look in the mirror. And so for self-improvement, I would urge people to be rational, to be principled and conceptual, to tie your ideas to reality with great care, and to make sure your ideas are all consistent. Because when that happens, when you start automatizing those kind of principles, then suddenly doing the right thing and having courage becomes easier and more automatized. You can be like Ayn Rand and let that $1 million check flutter into the rubbish bin and say, nope, that does not serve my interest. And you can be indifferent to the $1 million check from the Texas oil man.
Yes.
When you've achieved that kind of integrity, you're firing on all cylinders. Your morality is not the enemy of your life. And even if there's some short-term loss, $1 million check that you're letting flutter into a rubbish bin, you know that what you're doing is consistent with your long-term. And so at the end of your life, you can say with integrity, I fought for life. I fought for the sanctity of my own existence. I fought for what was in my own long-term interest, and I wasn't willing to compromise. I was willing to fight if necessary, risk my life, or risk losing my friends, or risk losing this lucrative job, or not be able to sleep with a supermodel.
You keep saying that one, Jim. I'm just thinking this ruins my night. so, so anyway, Jim. Before I just want to tell a quick story. In prison, one time I was talking. There was an old Quaker woman who was a volunteer, and we were talking. And I told her, I said, I'm very outspoken, in my views, and I tell people what I think, and often what I think of them. I told her, it amazes me that I'm not getting punched in the face. And she said to me something that always stood with me. She said, Michael, whether they recognize it or not, people respect integrity. And it was very powerful. It was over 20 years ago now, but it always stood with me and always
level,
will.
Everyone does know that adherence to principle is necessary, is our way of knowing, therefore our means of surviving, because that's our only basis for action. If I'm maintaining a contradiction, if I'm a hypocrite. See, hypocrite is a dirty word, and it really ought to be. It really, really ought to be. That's why even when we have these plays, like I say, Antigone or Man for All Seasons, plays I highly recommend everyone go and see. Because even though the principles that the heroine and the hero in those face are religion based, that's the problem. The problem was their values weren't life oriented, they were supernaturally oriented. But on the other hand, the fact, as I say, to say that someone has integrity, even a Christian martyr, you've already paid them an enormous compliment, at least half of the compliment of integrity. You had principles and you were willing to act on those principles. Those principles were not life oriented. They may not have been serving your long term interests. But on the other hand, you understood the importance of acting on principle. That is a highly admirable thing. And at some level, everybody knows that. You know, the compromiser knows that too. He's having the queasy feeling in his stomach. Why don't I feel satisfied about myself? You know, these people who I quoted you that earlier with an earlier discussion we had, that line from a Rush song. It is what an amazing thing. Some will sell their dreams for small desires. Ooh, emotion versus dream, if they're reality based. Some will sell their dreams for small desires and lose the race to rats. Right, now think about it. I don't want to engage in a rat race. I don't want to win or lose against rats, but you end up losing the race. What a beautiful, Neil Peart, the lyricist, was a great poet. He knew how to flip the cliche, right? The rat race.
What's the name of the song? I can't remember now. Signals? Subdivisions. Yeah, subdivisions.
Yes. And so the point is, don't run the race with rats.
Don't run the race with rats.
At all. Don't
Nice.
sell your highest dreams for small desires or short-term gains or social comfort. Don't rely on that emotion of the moment when it comes to something you know is in your long-term self-interest. No. Because those compromisers, like I say, at subconscious level, they know they've compromised. They can't feel good about themselves, to themselves. That, like I say, that mirror test. That guy looking back in the mirror is you're not gonna be so proud of him. You'll know that you haven't had that kind of integrity. Whereas at the end of the day, even if you take short term, you'll take the short term hit for the long term gain. The whole point there is you've got the long term gain. That is to say, at the end of the day, I've earned the trust of my colleagues. And now the judges and the defense bar, going back to my example of being a DA, now they trust me. So that when I come into court and say, no, this is the way it is, and this is what ought to happen, suddenly they're all standing up, their eyes are wide, and they're turning to me, and Jim Valliant says that, so I better pay attention. That's right.
The valiant Jim Valliant. All right, Jim, perfect place to wrap up, but where can they find you?
Well, here and sometimes on the Capitalist Corner, and sometimes I'm kibitzing on the various other shows you do, because you are such a busy man. But before I get into, you can find me on Facebook, James Stevens Valliant. I'm answering questions all the time. I'm doing for the Ayn Rand Center UK a series on the same book, OPAR. We're getting into the philosophical nuts and bolts of it, not just in terms of self-improvement. But my last comment I want to say to you, sir, is that you are a remarkable example of integrity. You're a man perfectly willing to stand up to whatever social forces are out there, whatever short-term emotional gain you have. You're constantly doing the self-inventory. You're constantly attempting to live by the values you know are in your long-term self-interest, even if that means you take a hit now. There is nothing more admirable than a person whose knows what their principles are and acts on them no matter what. And you, sir, I am proud to call my dear friend, because you exemplify integrity like few people I've ever known.
Thank you so much, sir. And we'll be back next time. I think we're doing honesty next. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.